so we would just find invoices and random things. And so we started just calling people who were out there who were working with, these intelligence operatives and stuff like that. So we call like there were
in these reams
CIA.
of papers that we got there are invoices that are unredacted with names and amounts and all kinds of
some of these guys are still alive. So we would just call them up and try to meet them. And there was this one guy who was an arms dealer who we know who had potentially done some work with John Nichols out there. We call him up.
We found that invoice later. We actually learned about him because we called a journalist who told us about another journalist who met a guy, and
so he was like, "Oh, you got to call him. I don't know if he'll talk to you. Like he's a real curmudgeon, but call him up, see what he says." And we call him up. We're just driving around. A lot of this was just us driving around and just like knocking on doors, like I said, and calling people randomly and just praying that they would pick up. And so we call this guy. And we're like, "Do you remember Dr. John Philip Nichols?" And he's like, "Oh man, that guy. Yeah, of course. Like, I was out there. He brought me in. I used to manufacture weapons, right? Like, I that's my job. And he brought me in because he wanted me to make silencers for him. So I go into the office there, the tribal office, and he's saying, how good are your silencers?" And I said, "Pretty good." He's like, "All right, well, why don't we," he's like, calls the secretary. He's like, "Bring us in some phone books." He's like, how many phone books do you need? He's like, to shoot through, I don't know, 5, 10 phone books? Bring in 10 phone books. Brings in 10 phone books. And in the office, in the tribal office, he pulls out the silencer, the 9mm, and he's like, "Keep the door open." Shoots this phone book, then brings the secretary in. He's like, Martha, whatever her name was, like, "Did you hear anything in here?" And she's like, "No." "What's that smell?" It's like the gunpowder smell. And he's like, "Pretty good." John Nichols was like, "All right, we like the product." So
this guy also, he brands himself, he tells it, he is a gun manufacturer, but he also says that he is a gun fighter. Like,
oh God, yeah.
Right. And so, winking very aggressively that he's not in the CIA, you know what I mean, or says that he was.
Was the age? Does the age match up to Vietnam or like?
I think most of his work was in Central and South America.
Okay.
But he is a contractor, is what he was saying. But he did not end up manufacturing stuff with John Nichols because he said that he was like, but he wanted to pay me in shrimp. And we're like, what? And he's like, John Nichols was such a hustler. He wanted, he's like, I didn't want to get involved with this guy. He's just dripping with agency connections because he's introducing me to people like the Jackal, and you don't know the Jackal unless you know somebody in the agency. It's like what?
Like Carlos the Jackal?
That's what he was saying. That he had arranged a meeting with it, and so he's like, he tells us that John Nichols was going. He was like, I want to sell all this stuff, all these like submachine guns and things over to the Philippines, okay? We're going to do like small arms to the Philippines. They don't have a lot of money, but they do have shrimp.
Pan fried, deep fried, stir fried.
And so they were going to...
What? Facts.
And he's like, so he was designing a way for us to set up a manufacturing facility, carry it out on it could only touch federal roads by the time these guns got to the shipping port on the coast. Couldn't touch state land because that's why they were doing it. Is the state of California, they couldn't have any state laws touched. And then we would put it on boats and they would bring us shrimp in return. He's like, what am I going to do with all that shrimp? Like I just can't do the shrimp. And so we just met up with this dude. We go to his he's like a boutique arms manufacturer. He does a lot of like law enforcement, whatever. He says he no longer works with the CIA because those guys or he calls them the Christians in action.
He said the same thing about Hollywood.
Yeah, he said that those guys are assholes.
Well,
they tried to kill him, all this stuff. But we go into this place.
There's a McLaren sports
beautiful.
car.
It's like you could eat off the floor, and it's like it's
He's
where
got
he
a
makes
McLaren?
like
just in the shop.
And it's sitting there as this like McLaren sports car and just like this incredible tool belt. And we're just like, it's like 5 p.m. on a Tuesday and we called him an hour earlier and just drove to his place. He was like, yeah, come meet me there. And we're just sitting in there. After a while talking to him, I was just like, dude, what makes you think that we're not,
In the CIA, yeah.
intelligence operatives. He's like, I'm not worried about you guys.
That's so disrespectful.
I know. I was like, well, buddy, we could, you know.
I mean,
This guy was a major.
Did he say that
scary
he's
dude.
a sociopath?
Yeah, he told us straight up. He was just like, the kind of work I do. He's like, I'm what you call a sociopath.
Interesting.
And we're like, oh, okay. And he's like, as long as you know that's who you are, you can do a lot of amazing things in life. I was like, okay, cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of characters in this.
Did he show you? Did he show you any?
Yeah.
Any?
Essentially, what
Any
we got on.
weapons?
Yeah.
Yeah, he showed us a lot of
he had
weapons.
a shit ton of weapons around, and he's basically retired now. But basically, what the West Coast part of this story is that we got onto, that I became excited about when Christian was talking to me about it, is a group of extremely intelligent, likely, I'm not a psychiatrist, likely sociopathic people who are committing crimes with the government, sometimes maybe for the government, often for organized crime, and also just freelance for themselves. We were asking the arms dealer, that guy, about another character that we can talk about, and he was like, we were saying he was committing murders in the United States. He's like, oh yeah, doing work on the side, huh? Can't do that. And it's like, oh man, you know, this is just, it's kind of an accepted, weird, strange world that we started looking into, all these brilliant guys who were doing, to my morals, very bad things.